Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, wherever you are. We are here today for a very important event, very important conversation. My name is Salil Tripathi. I'm an advisor at the Institute for Human Rights and Business, which is a global think and do tank on corporate accountability and trying to shape practices of companies. I have two excellent panelists with me. I've got Baroness Lola Young, who is, of course, a member of the House of Lords and has been a broadcaster, has been an actor, and has been one of the tireless campaigners to end modern forms of slavery. And also have Sam Gyimah, who has been a minister for almost 10 years on universities and education, and was a candidate for the Liberal Democratic Party in the last parliamentary election here in Britain. We are going to have a conversation about Black Lives Matters, what it has meant here in Britain. I say here in Britain because my panelists are in Britain. I lived in London for a long time. I'm in New York at the moment, but that's where we are. So without further ado, I think, Lola, if I may start with you, you have made an enormous contribution to the campaign against modern forms of slavery. The phrase is an important one. There is a strange sense of complacency around the world, and particularly in the UK, that slavery is a problem of the past. Britain has moved on from that past. It has abolished slavery before the Americans did. It did it without a fratricidal civil war like the US had to go through. And in the late 19th century, Britain replaced slavery with a form of contract labor that would, what we in India used to call girmitiyas, that would bring people from one part of the world to another to work in plantations and farms in Africa, in the Caribbean, in Southeast Asia. But it also granted freedom to the workers, often from Asia and Africa, so that they could lead independent lives later in those countries. There is a question about the extent to which those contracts were with informed consent of the signatories, and did they sign on those because of economic deprivation and desperation. But at the heart of the colonial era practice was race. But Britain has this sense of comfort that it has overcome the problem, and yet the government in recent years has made combating slavery a major plank. It has used a categorical imperative of human rights, using terms like zero tolerance, and yet we have tragedies, from Chinese cockle pickers at Morecambe Bay to overheated trucks packed with Vietnamese workers. We continue to be reminded of injustices and horrors of modern trafficking. And as the events of recent weeks have shown, our cities have monuments honoring those who have enslaved others or enriched themselves from it, be it Colston in Bristol, Milligan in London, and indeed right in London, there is a statue of Robert Clive and of Cecil Rhodes at Oriel College. Now, how do you evaluate the British record? Is there room for complacency? Is there a lot more that needs to be done collectively?
Wow. What a question to start with, Salil. Thank you very much for throwing all of that at me. I mean, you've packed in, sort of huge number of books, essays, PhDs, and what have you into that question. But I mean, these are very serious issues, and I'll try and unpack some of them. And perhaps, if I'm going over, time a little bit, please do feel free to interrupt me and say that's quite enough, Lola. Thank you very much. So actually, I'm going to take the last part of your question first, which I believe was about complacency and have we done enough? And I think and this may sound incredibly idealistic, but I think we have to have these aims until we have eliminated all forms of labor exploitation, forced labor, child trafficking, human trafficking, adult trafficking, all of those oppressive kinds of practices have been eliminated. We still have work to do. And we've got a long, long way, of course, to go on that. You mentioned what I take to be a reference to the transatlantic slave trade. That was a couple of 100 years in getting rid of just the transatlantic slave trade on British ships. That's what we commemorated in 1807. It wasn't the abolition of slavery by any means. And what I think you're referring to, what I would call indentured labor, had huge problems with it. Was barely any better than enslavement of Africans. It just hauled in another group of people. So yes, we have these awful things that have happened in the past, and we have a certain kind of continuity with what's going on now. So the question for me is, for any government, and I'm quite happy to be that person who keeps prodding government to say, if you really want to eliminate this, how are you going to do it? How are you going to do it within your own supply chains, within government and public procurement? How are you going to do it in terms of ensuring that businesses live up to what's in their modern slavery statements, which were introduced in the 2015 Act. How are we going to make these words of, yes, we want to be world leaders in the elimination of modern forms of slavery? How are you going to make those words into action? So that, to me, those are the key questions that we need to ask, and how we actually do that in terms of international cooperation, because those people who are at the heart of slavery, trafficking, forced labor, abusive labor, all of those forms, they don't respect national borders. Therefore, we have to have a really concerted international push on this, and to recognize that that push will take many, many years.
I'm glad you brought up the issue of national borders, because Sam, the question I'm coming to you with is largely dealing with that in a sense. And Brexit is an issue on which you reflected a lot. You've taken major political decisions in your own life, in personal life, about how to respond to that. Britain is turning inward looking. I mean, we know that for a fact. It's taken this big decision. And we also know that free trade, free movement of capital, free movement of ideas are important for a society. Universities, a department that you held, is reliant increasingly, on talent from everywhere. So is the National Health Service, and is reliant on that as well. Now, if you were to reflect on that, and then we were to look at another aspect of British society, which is the corporate setup. If we look at the FTSE 100 companies, here are the statistics that only one chief executive out of the 100 companies is Black, only one Latin American, and only 5% are women in Britain. And if we look at FTSE 200, it's only 2% of the CEOs are women. Across the pond, here in the US, the figures are only marginally better for women, 37 women out of 500 of the Fortune 500. Only 5 Black men running Fortune 500 companies, and only 7 Indian Americans. I mean, that figure is higher than. So I'm just curious about the boardrooms and the way they are looking at it. How is the upper echelons of corporate setup geared to look at that? How receptive is it for diversity? And how does it go about it? What has been your experience?
Well, thank you. And can I say firstly, thank you for hosting this event. And I particularly liked it, Salil, in your introduction when you said you are looking at Black Lives Matter from the British perspective. The reason why I like that is that there's been the temptation among some to see this as an American thing. It happened in America, and the whole race thing is an American thing, and we in Britain are fine. Nothing to see here, nothing to worry about. Now, of course, the British history around issues of race is not exactly the same as the American one, but there are still real issues here that we need to address. So I think it's I really appreciate you looking at it from the British perspective. The second thing I'll say by my sort of introductory remarks is I very much agree with Baroness Young and kind of what she said around indentured slavery and what needs to be done around the supply chain. But that is, of course, as you point out in your question, not the only area, and there are 2 parts to your question to me. One is turning inward, and the other is what we see in the boardroom. And my parents, they're immigrants. They moved to the UK in the 70s, and I was born here, but I grew up in Ghana, and then I came back. And I think what is the real danger with the UK situation now is, whilst a lot of effort policy-wise is being put into attracting brilliant scientists who have already made it, the vast majority of immigrants who are successful here don't arrive here already having won a Nobel laureate, a Nobel Prize. They arrive here and they work hard and they are ambitious for themselves and their children. So I think to say that somehow, to use that as a pointer, that look, we are welcoming brilliant scientists, so therefore we are being open and expansive to the world, it's not really the case. If you're going to be open and expansive to the world, I think it's about people who are talented, who are entrepreneurial, people who can make their way here. And why is it important? Obviously, every country wants and should be able to control its borders, but it is what Britain has benefited immensely over the years from immigration, and that's positive story has not always been told. The UK has got a population of just over 60 million, 65 million. It's second to the US in terms of research citations in the world, but a lot of our scientists are people who start as research fellows on earning almost not very much, who come from abroad.
Mhm.
You look at the 2012 Olympics and Team GB, there were lots of people who were second generation immigrants who have come in and are doing really well. And if you look at the world of business, it's the same story. So the success of Britain is the success of immigration. The fact that the country has been a melting pot, and therefore, in my view, celebrating the end to freedom of movement, as some people do, is slightly odd. It seems to me you're turning your back on what has made the country successful. And I think that at this time when it's easy there are very difficult policy challenges, right? Whether around living standards, inequality, climate action, and now the pandemic and the economic crisis that it's caused. It is very easy and lazy to seek solutions in saying, if only we shut our borders, all will be fine. I think it is the lazy approach, and one that should be resisted. In terms of the second part of your question, which is what is happening in corporate boardrooms and at the top of organizations, one of the things that has surprised me is we have a managerial caste now, CEOs, chairmen of boards, chairwomen of boards, who have been all educated at the top schools.
Mm.
And one of the most important things they are taught is your decisions have got to be data-driven. What gets measured in a company is what gets done.
Right.
But what they don't measure is things like ethnic minority representation.
Mhm.
It is not measured, and so there is no consistent effort to address it. And what I think is it's not enough just saying you're anti-racist, that you actually have to be intentional about it and take action. And so if all these great senior leaders of organizations are going to take action, they've got to measure progress, they've got to be honest about where the gaps are, and there's got to be action that follows. What is not right is where you have something like, obviously, the tragic death of George Floyd happens, and companies race out to issue statements. There is a town hall meeting, there is the post on LinkedIn, initiatives are announced. There is no accountability as to what actually gets followed through. And so we hit the next tragedy,
Mhm.
and then the whole thing starts all over again. But what I'm hoping, certainly judging by the depth of feeling, not just in the US, but around the world, and the fact that certainly you are seeing, whether it was the protest marches or even seeing the conversations that I'm part of, that it's got a broad spectrum of the population listening, engaged in this, sharing ideas, wanting to change minds, that actually that we are at a turning point in terms of moving forward on this. But I think if there's one thing corporates need to do, it's measure, be honest about where you are behind, and take action to address it. I mean, there are obviously a number of things that follow on from that. But if we were doing that, we would break the cycle of initiative after initiative that don't go anywhere.
Absolutely. And Sam, that's a very good point you made about measuring, because one of the things we've noticed is that you have companies which are very quick to issue very affirmative statements and affirming statements and positive statements, but whether they think through the impacts of some of the other actions that they do, which are almost in a silo. So a company might have a beautiful, inspiring statement on its website, but it might be a consulting company, and it tells other companies to downsize because of the COVID crisis, without thinking through that when the downsizing takes place, is it going to be the ethnic minorities which are going to be let go first? And is their employment situation going to worsen or not? So I think there's a lot more of introspection needed, and I think that's a very good point. Thank you. Lola, I wanted to turn to you and reflect a bit on your career as well. And drawn on what Sam was speaking about. You started out as an actor, and I was just curious about breaking into the profession then versus now. If a person is from a minority, is it easier today for a young person, even in the corporate life? How does it play out, or is it there is this perception that everything is fine, everything is meritocratic?
Okay, it's a very interesting point to make, because actually, maybe somewhat surprisingly, being an actor was my kind of political education, if you like, because I happened to work at a number of different places where there was really hot debate about all of the key issues of the day. Interestingly, not much about race, because everybody knew that theatre was really inclusive, didn't they? And we're talking about the 70s, so of course it wasn't. And although things have improved somewhat today, we're still having to fight these battles. One of the things I also reflect on from that period, and it comes to this issue around race and history, is the extent to which we're prepared to accept tokenism rather than normalization. And in those days, I very clearly remember having conversations with producers as part of my trade union role, which went, can you do something about integrated casting and have more people playing a wider variety of roles? And the producer would say, we can't do that. I mean, how could you possibly have a black man as a bank manager? And it was like, that was the ultimate impossible thing to do. So you could have a black person in the crowd, or as a nurse, or as a prostitute in a non-speaking role, but you couldn't do much else. As I say, we've moved on a little bit from that, but you can ask yourself why it is that we still have this issue that, particularly in this country, some of our greatest and best black actors have to go to the States in order to get anything approaching a decent role. So we still have those issues. But I want, if I may, just to kind of come back to something that Sam said, which is about holding people and organizations to account. All of these wonderful statements, as he said, have been made over the past few weeks. And I'm interested in the ways in which we might be able to do that. So I'm thinking about specific sectors and looking at getting a bunch of people together, and we look at their statements about what they've said now, and then in 3, 6, 9 or 12 months, we'll come back to them and say, hey, well, you know what, from the outside, your organization looks exactly the same as it did when you made that statement. Could you perhaps tell us what it is that you've done and what it is you intend to do in order to improve the situation? Because I do think, a certain number of organizations fall away from these commitments, and I think that's something that we really do have to make sure that people, especially those that are in receipt of public money one way or another.
Thank you. And what you're basically saying is walk the talk. I think you're probably not seeing Lola on screen, but we are able to hear you. I think there is, maybe you need to refresh your browser, or maybe
okay, will do.
Backend are probably helping you with that. So, but anyway, my next question is for Sam. So I'll turn to that. Sam, you were, as you said, you went through your personal history a little bit when you were speaking just now. You were born in Britain, but you went to Ghana after that and came back. Your schooling was at a state school, and then you went to Oxford. Wonderful story of, second generation immigrant life and so on. But can you reflect a bit on the barriers you may have faced? You were at college in 1997, became the Oxford Union president. But were you ever singled out? Did you ever feel stopped and searched? Did you have unpleasant encounters? Did that shape and made you what you are?
Yes. One of the things you try not to do in these situations too much is argue purely from your own personal experience. And we all have our personal stories, and whether it's women in the workplace, other minorities as well. But just to sort of give some color, because I grew up in Ghana, I think when I arrived in the UK and was going to school in the UK at the age of 17, I had a very different perspective, which is I'd grown up in an environment that was majority Black. So I didn't look at myself initially and think, I'm in a minority. For me, it was absolutely normal to be in the majority, and to think, when I thought about my aspirations, to think that the aspirations were totally normal and totally acceptable because of what had shaped me very much in my early years. But kind of as I went through it, what I realized was the difference between how that formation impacted on me and how I went about things versus some other friends of mine, friends of color that I had. Firstly, whether you feel you can even achieve, how you interact with power, how you set your ambitions, were all very much in a different place. And in terms of discrimination, a lot of it along the way, but I think the bits that I find most useful to discuss in this kind of context is what I will call the deep-rooted discrimination that happens rather than, I couldn't get this job because of this. So, for example, being, as an MP, being mistaken for the chief whip's driver by another MP, right? And I kind of think that if I looked different and had floppy hair, that would never have crossed the person's mind. Kind of when I walked into the office, or when you are walking down the street and you see someone sees you, and if I'm not in my suit and tie, as I would have been a lot when I was an MP, somebody sees you and suddenly moves their handbag from one side to another. Right. But the real thing is you then begin to censor your own behavior because you don't want them to feel uncomfortable. And I think it's as I began to sort of think about these sort of some of them small incidents that I was experiencing. I'm looking for my children at a park. I wandering around. Someone sees me. I'm in casual clothes. They're with their child, and they look at you like they're scared. So I start shouting my child's name very loudly to give them assurance that I'm also a parent.
Yes.
And the real thing here is it's an experience that if you are white, you will never go through.
Right.
And so you will never understand what it means that actually even happens.
Absolutely.
And I think that is the kind of what I call deep-rooted discrimination. That means you have unequal prospects in this country. Yep. And I really like what Baroness Young said about not accepting tokenism and rather going for normalization. Because in all the environments I've been in, I have often been the first and the only one in the room.
Mm.
And at a personal level, you can think it's satisfying. It might give leaders of organizations something to point to when they're attacked. But Sam's made it. We're open-minded.
Yeah.
But you have it shouldn't be that the people who, through either luck or sort of being exceptional, make it. Opportunity should genuinely be open to all. And I think that it kind of, if you're going back to your question about kind of my experiences and, abuse, and yes, I face it and I still continue to face it.
Mm.
And yes, when I was a minister in SW1, of course, people got your profile raises, people get to know who you are. It's not as much. But if I'm not in an SW1 context,
yeah,
I am like every other Black person. And so it is a big problem.
I know, and I think, thank you for sharing that, because it mustn't have been easy recounting these instances. But I remember once Sajid Javed was giving a speech to a British Asian event that I was in the audience, where he said that he often gets mistaken for Sadiq Khan, and he takes it as a compliment because, of course, Sadiq Khan is a good friend, and Sadiq was also in the room, and it was all very nice. But I can see exactly where this leads, and what this ends up being about being mistaken for something that you're not, and the baggage that comes with it, and what you say actually can be discomforting, and it is meant to. And this is what Robin DiAngelo talks about in her book, White Fragility. And I think we do need to, and the whole idea about Black Lives Matter versus All Lives Matter, I think people need to think about why the focus is and needs to be on Black lives. So thank you for saying that, Sam. Absolutely. Lola, I wanted to turn to you next, and which is about the whole. I mean, there are several questions and several comments that I can see warmly praising and thanking you for the leadership you've given on modern slavery. So I thought I wanted to acknowledge that 3 or 4 people have said that. So thank you for that. If we look at trafficking, which is so much at the core of British thinking and government's policy. And then if we reflect back to the Windrush generation and what happened to the generation that came to help build the country in a way and had to I mean, in a very awkward way, they were treated so badly after that. How do we put humane approaches at the center of human rights? I think there was one of the questions was, do we need to think of diversity and inclusion when we think of modern slavery and trafficking?
Yes, again, another big question, Salil. So thanks for that. Because I'm really glad that you've made the connections between all of these different things. And I think this is one of the really important moves to be able to make, as it were. So the way that I'm trying to think through is we have this big basket of issues ranging from environmental sustainability to modern slavery to inequality and poverty, discrimination, racism, all of these huge things. They're all interconnected. But there's a level on which if you start to think, oh my gosh, these are all interconnected, it's like, oh, how can I possibly deal with anything because it's too big? But I think that we have to find a way of saying, yes, it's huge, keeping in mind that holistic view, which enables us to connect the dots, but saying at any one time, here's the priority on which we need to focus. And it might be a whole suite of priorities, it may be one thing. So I think that's a kind of, it's like it's an intellectual move, by which I mean, we've got to find the ways of making our brains accommodate that. Because to me, if you don't, what happens is you ask the wrong questions. Mm-hmm. You know, I was on a call this morning about modern forms of slavery and exploitation and trafficking in this country. So first of all, we have to get more people to acknowledge and understand that it happens in this country, not only in terms of women and children being forced into the sex trade and indeed boys and men, but also in terms of in supply chains and other forms of trafficking. This is going on in a place near you somewhere right now. And I think to connect it up to the point that you've been making and to this whole issue of Black Lives Matter is that first of all, a lot of the people who are bearing the brunt of these problems will be Black and brown, or however you want to language that. And maybe we can come back to the point about language later, because I know there's a question on it. It's not only about that, but it's also about who you ask or who you work with to support in the fight against these forms of exploitation and abuse. And I've been, I'm starting to work with Afruka, which is one of the organizations that I've learned about in the past year, that is Black-led, Black-run organization, which is trying to combat trafficking in this country and working with local communities. And by local, I mean diaspora communities from particular vulnerable populations, about how to combat this, how to raise awareness about it, and how to address some of the practices that have become normalized within some of those areas that really are not appropriate anymore. So it's a very complex bundle, because as soon as you start to focus on those groups, it's then like, oh, okay, all of those Black people do this, or all of those Asian people do this, and look what they've done, and look what they're like. So that's why we need this much more grounded, much more holistic view, which says we can take on board those historical and cultural issues that have come to the surface, and that we can take them on board without punishing the people for having been through those experiences. And yet we can say, look, this is what we need to do to make this scenario different. And I think those ways of working are not really encouraged in government, and they're not really encouraged in a lot of businesses either. And the way to make that way of thinking more present is to have a greater range of people involved in decision making and implementation. Now, I just avoided saying a greater diversity, because that word has become so debased. I mean, when I hear people talking about, oh, diversity just means, lots of people thinking a bit differently, it's meant to be deeper than that. Somebody's raised the question about the use of the term BAME. I hate it. It's horrible. I'm not BAME. I don't look in the mirror and see BAME. I don't see my son as BAME. So what are we talking about here? So let's again sort of disaggregate what we mean by all those different communities that are included in that, at the same time as recognizing that there is a big issue to be addressed here. And at the same time as saying, but at this particular moment, where we need to focus on is here, 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 and here. And, we've got the experts in our communities to deal with that.
I was talking to Geeta Sehgal, who was with the South All Black Sisters a couple of days ago. She was telling me exactly that BAME is a bureaucratic term. Nobody calls himself or herself as BAME. And there was a political reason why non-white women in the 1970s chose to call themselves black. I mean, of course they were not black, they were brown and what kind of shades were there. I mean, and ethnicities were involved there. So it's not that the color became a symbol of resistance and power. And I think that was exactly the question we had, and you dealt with it. That to see what is a bureaucratic convenience and try to aggregate a large mass of people into that can be profound.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And South All Black Sisters, I remember them, of course I remember them because they've been working for so long and bringing together those things. And I think what it does, or what it did in the 70s and perhaps a little bit of the 80s as well, was to say, black is a political term. And because it refers to a white person's perception of our skin tones. And so what we're saying here in terms of South All Black Sisters and other groups at the time is that we know you see us as kind of this, homogeneous bunch of brown-skinned people, and you see us in that way. Well, we see ourselves as a point of solidarity that can bring us together, and together we can combat the kinds of things that you're saying about us and at us, and make that space our own. And I think that was why it was a really strong politically informed move that wasn't about trying to obliterate differences between different communities, but to say we stand together in solidarity against this oppression.
Absolutely. Thank you. Sam, I wanted to turn to you about the government and its response to COVID-19, and not so much to speak about the virus and lockdowns and whether one can go up for a drive and to look at the castle or not. That's not what we're getting into.
But I on that too.
I'm sure, yes. But what I want to know about, what we do know for a fact, and this is a sad reality, both in the UK and in the US and in other countries, that people who are from economic deprivation, people who are from ethnic minorities are more likely to get the virus, more likely to die, more likely to fall ill. Now, not for a moment am I suggesting that there is difference in treatment, because the NHS is colorblind in the nice and right sense of the term. So I'm not suggesting that, but I'm just curious that are our responses getting shaped in manners which are getting complicated because of the way we look at it? And when there's this whole move to restart the economy, which is big in the US. Some states have already gone ahead with it. In Britain, there are lots of people frustrated and want to move forward. Is it happening that the people who are at the front end of services, whether they are the support staff, whether the nurses, the doctors, if you're talking about NHS, the delivery people, when we're talking about grocery, they're more likely to be from minorities. And if they're going to be more likely from minorities, it requires a more nuanced way of looking at reopening, and not simply that we have to get the GDP back in action.
No, so, a lot of important points there. I think the issue of the virus and the relative impact on minorities. And by the way, Lola, I absolutely agree with you, the term BAME. I describe myself as BAME, or my children as BAME children. But the impact is, and it goes to sort of, the first thing I'll say is the government's response to the whole Black Lives Matter issue, which is they don't want people to feel victimized, and this movement is just making people feel victimized. Now, kind of, if you are on the front line of the NHS and you're more likely to catch COVID as a result, you're not playing the victim, right? You are really experiencing something that you should not be experiencing. And I think that is just a way of sidestepping what is a real issue, because although the virus itself, is colorblind, the effect of the virus is not. And I think across our society, what has happened is where there are weaknesses, they've been massively exposed by COVID. And where there are strengths, they've been very much exposed, whether it's in terms of businesses, whether it's in terms of inequality, whether it's even in terms of the homes we live in and who has a garden and who doesn't. So it is a big problem here. Now, when you look at what is happening in the NHS, color is not a comorbidity. Right? So the reason why so many ethnic minorities are overexposed to the virus and are more likely to get it, if they work in the NHS, it's because they are more likely to work in roles where they are interacting with people who have the virus. In other words, they are not the people at the top, working from home on Zoom calls. They are the ones actually at the front line. And that needs to be recognized. But not just recognized, it means that, whether testing, we need proper testing of people who work at the front line consistently so that they can have the support that they need. It also means that when you look more broadly within our society, inequality, which is being dismissed, and you can always play around with the statistics, is a real issue, whether it's, and the consequences of inequality, whether it's diet, whether it's health conditions, all of that is being exposed. And the discussion, therefore, of how we rebuild better after COVID needs to address these issues as well. Yeah. And that goes back to my original point, which is, I'm glad you're having this. Black Lives Matter is not a Black people's issue. It's not an American issue. It is an issue that affects all of us. And this is one clear example that demonstrates that.
Yeah, and just to reinforce and stress your point, both Ben Goldacre and a bunch of scientists have come together to do an extremely good and forensic analysis of statistics from NHS, which I would urge those who have not seen it to look at it. And an article recently in Lancet magazine by Angela Saini, who also speaks about NHS, and exactly the color is not the comorbidity, as you put it so well. I was going to ask about BAME, but we have got that question addressed, so I will not go into that. But I'm looking at the questions we've received, and 2 have received a lot of support. So I think we have about 7 or 8 minutes left. So I'll turn to those 2 questions, and you can take, either of them can take them in the order in which you want. One is from Benafsha Delgado, which is that the private sector has had the opportunity to positively contribute to address minority underrepresentation in the workplace. What are some of the practical steps they can take, which is about the businesses? And the other question is from Leena Patel, which is that we can't truly create an equal society unless we tackle the criminal justice system, where again, she uses the word BAME here, but in its bureaucratic sense, there is a disproportionate impact. Businesses have a very powerful voice, and how do we engage them and be more vocal in using their influence in terms of criminal checks that are sometimes making it harder for people from those backgrounds to get into the employment ladder. So over to both of you on those 2. Yeah.
Can I jump in here, Sam?
Yes.
Just very quickly. No, because I've answered both of these questions online, but I'm going to talk a little bit about the criminal justice system one, because I think that's been cited as in reference to David Lammy's report as making people into victims, which I thought Sam picked up really well in his earlier remarks. And it is really interesting. I don't read it like that, and I can sort of say maybe that's because I have an interest in it. I was part of the advisory group, and I've done my own review. And I think but for me, it is a classic case of where you talk about Black and minority ethnic people in one lump, as it were. But then what you need to do is you need to look at where is it most urgent to make an intervention. And to my mind, and hence the work that I did with various colleagues a couple of years ago, the issue of young Black men between the ages of around 18 to 25 and young Muslim men who were overrepresented throughout the system and had the worst outcomes at the end of going through the gate. And I think, yes, there is, I mean, numerous examples I could cite to you of the problems that causes. I think the criminal records check issue is at one end, as it were, of the system. That assumes you're out of the system and you're looking for a job. I'm actually more interested, and I think we should be focusing on the pipeline into the system, which starts with expulsions from schools, maybe, being in care, maybe, going to pupil referral units, maybe, getting involved in county lines, maybe, you know, there are a number of different factors. How can we address those? And so I think that this idea that somehow by drawing attention to a problem, you're saying that the people to whom you're drawing attention are victimized, and therefore you're stopping them from making progress on their own. If we didn't have those reports, does anybody seriously think that somehow people would suddenly jump up and say, hey, actually, now we're not being victimized anymore. We can not get involved in the criminal justice system, not be expelled from schools, not be put in these PRUs. Of course, that's not the case. So, you know, it's to me a somewhat lazy way of dismissing what is going on in our communities.
Thank you. Sam, your thoughts?
Well, I very much agree with everything that Lola has said. And with the criminal justice system in particular, the problems start long before the van pulls up at the prison gate with the prisoners. And a lot of it is what is happening deep in society. And going back to my point around inequalities and addressing them, whether it's in the school system, whether it's around housing, whether it's support for families, I think all of that is absolutely essential. Because once people get into the criminal justice system, and I was prisons minister for a while, it is very difficult for them to get out. And once you have that mark on you, it's incredibly hard. Life becomes incredibly hard. And the question is why there is a disproportionate number of young ethnic minority men at Feltham Young Offenders Institute, and what we're doing about it. I think that's the big question. And it's the question that, going back to the victimization point, unless there is political pressure, politics responds to pressure, and unless there is pressure to address and deal with these issues, people just accept it as fact. That's the way these ones are, and just leave them to it.
Thank you. We have about 2 more minutes, but I think we can extend it by the question I'm going to put to both of you, because I think in a way you can sum up what we have been talking. It's a very complicated subject, I'm aware. And it's always terrible to think about that these are the 3 things that should be done. I mean, but that's exactly the approach I'm suggesting, that for both of you, what's the one thing that corporate Britain should stop doing? What's the one thing that it should build on? And what is it that it has not done that it should do to make Britain a better society? And how do we build a better Britain? Not only from the perspective of the roads and airport runways and having more Olympics and things like that, but so that everybody feels truly included. And Team GB ideals that we've had, truly multicultural, multi-ethnic Britain can be a reality.
You go first this time, Sam.
I think the way I would answer the question is kind of what's the one thing we can do is, I think this needs to be treated as an issue that is a societal issue. Mm-hmm. What we've got now is polarization. Some people saying this is a real problem you've got to deal with. And others say, look at the progress we've made, there is no problem. And I mean, this is a very polite way of putting it. If you look at the United States in particular, it's got deep polarization along political lines. And I think to make progress, this needs to be treated as a society-wide issue. I honestly believe that white people have got to feel empowered to also speak positively around issues of race, and to deal with issues of race without feeling that there is going to be a backlash. Mm-hmm. I just end by saying there's a good friend of mine who's a vice chancellor of a leading university speaking to him, he'd written a beautiful poem about Black Lives Matter. I said to him, why didn't you publish it? He said, no, it's not an issue for me, it's an issue for Black people. And I think till we get to the point where people like him feel publicly they can speak about it and they care, we're not going to have the kind of alliance and allies we need to break through in society.
I totally agree with that. So I won't repeat it. But what I will say is I think, to me, this is so fundamental. You have to go to the heart of what is business for. You know, what I would say to any corporate entity to ask themselves, what are you for, and what is it that you're adding to the world for human beings? What is the framework within which you're working? If your sole motivation is to produce profit for shareholders, then you are not going to deliver on some of these big other issues. If we're not looking at people and planet as well as profitability, then you're on a hiding to nothing. And I think that really the modern corporation, as indeed some businesses are already discovering and beginning to work towards, should be working within a framework which says we are creating benefit for the world. We are benefiting people. And how do we do that? We do that by looking at ourselves, asking ourselves these really hard questions, and then finding solutions to those problems which we encounter. So if we look around our organization and see we haven't got any Black people in anywhere other than cleaning floors and opening doors and stopping people from coming in the building, what are you at really as a business? What is it that you are here to do? And I think some of those questions need to be asked within the organizations, and then only then, when you have the honest answers to those, including, as Sam has said, for white people to think about what has been their role in stopping Black people getting into that organization in influential positions. Until we get to that stage, then we'll be business as usual, unfortunately.
Yeah, and we have to move to the business as unusual. Thank you so much. That's you're both thrown very important challenges for everyone who cares about Black lives and about Britain. And I think that's a very sobering but challenge-oriented note to end on. Before I go away, first of all, thank you to both of you and to the questions that came through. I'm sorry we couldn't go through all of them, but we did try to do justice. One brief announcement: next week at the same time, we have another conversation where we will be talking about what's happening in the US and the impact of US companies around the world because of their presence. And we have three speakers who have confirmed. One is Dominique Day, who is at the UN expert group on people of African descent. She's a human rights lawyer. We also have Ella Bell-Smith, who teaches African American economic issues at Tuck School of Business at Dartmouth College. And she has written a book on Black and white women and their perception in a corporation. And we have Andrea Schoenberg, who's a human rights lawyer who's been involved with Amnesty International in the past, but she is the chair of the Global Business Initiative on Human Rights. So that should be another exciting conversation. We hope to bring many more of those. Thank you again for those who joined in, those who stayed, and thank you once again, Lola and Sam.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.